this is a discussion I've been looking forward to. I was telling my wife on the way to the venue that I'm also feeling very nervous, talking to someone like yourself with your stature, with your accomplishments and about the book itself. So I think I'll try and do a good job of it. Let's see how it goes. So I think, first of all, congratulations, and thank you for writing such a wonderful book. I think Dr. Somnath also spoke about it, you spoke about it. I think amongst the many books on ISRO, this is pretty unique in the sense that Dan, who is the author of this book, is just looming in the background, pretty much as an observer and not someone who's played a very important role in shaping the journey of this company. So first of all, amazing thing. I think I liked the kind of people that you described. The book is as much about the missions of ISRO as much as the people behind those missions. It's very, very interesting. I read it a couple of times, and every time I read it, it was very, inspiring too. So let's just begin with a beautiful name like, Aravamudan and Aravamudan. How did it get translated to Dan? Why did he get known as Dan? How did he get that moniker?
Aravamudan is actually a very Tamil name, and it is the name of a deity in Kumbakonam. So his parents have given all their children, names like Rajagopal and Aravamudan and so on. His father's name was Aravamudan. But most people found it very difficult to pronounce. Even Tamilians found it difficult to pronounce if they didn't know the name itself. In Karnataka, forget it. Nobody knows the name. In Kerala, where we were living for most of the time, nobody knew how to pronounce the name, though we would keep saying it. And the first thing that happened was when Dan joined ISRO, he went to NASA. And you can imagine how the Americans did it. But strangely enough, it's certain, like the Germans and the French, they are able to pronounce it because they look at it, look at the pronunciation by reading the letters. So Dan says the moment he got down and he stood there, the American who came to say, you'll be called Dan because you will never be able to pronounce your name. And so that name stuck, mainly because most people didn't know how to pronounce his name, and he said it takes too much explanation. So right through ISRO, he was known as Dan, and Dan was always a person who would make a lot of jokes. So he says, as long as you don't call me Thiru Dan, which would be the correct Tamil way of calling him. So that was his so everybody, even at home, everybody called him Dan.
So I think it'd be nice to start at the very beginning. Probably you can just tell us a little bit about Dan's early life, his childhood, the place, the family that he grew up in, the basic beliefs in the family, and the kind of background, and how did he go on to become a rocket scientist, or even before becoming a rocket scientist, I think he worked at the Department of Atomic Energy. So tell us a little bit about his early days, his family, his siblings, and all of that.
His dad was born in a family of 9 children. He had 8 siblings, and it was a very traditional Tamil Iyengar family, where his father was working in Tata's as in a middle-level job, and the main thing is that they wanted all their children to be well educated. They put a lot of emphasis on education. So there were 5 brothers and 4 sisters. All of them went to college. The brothers, most of them became engineers. The thing was that Dan was, I think, a little particularly bright. So he was able to get into engineering college on his own merit. You remember at that time in the 1950s and 60s, there was a lot of reservations. And particularly, it was difficult for Brahmins to get into engineering college, but he got in on his merit. And since he stood first in the MIT entrance exam, the MIT took care of all his fees and all that, which his father couldn't afford at that time. And he stood first even when he passed out of college. So he was recruited by Atomic Energy, and Atomic Energy, instead of putting him into the training school, made him a training school teacher. So he was there, but he was very bored with atomic energy because it was a very routine kind of job. So when somebody came and told him, there is somebody that there's a person called Sarabhai looking out and they're going to start a space program over here. He said, I want to go and join. He said he would apply. And he told his parents, and his father was quite upset with him. He said, first of all, we were worried, we wanted you to get a job and all that. Why do you want to give up a government job and go after somebody else's dream? What's going to happen to you? But I think he was pretty young at that time, 22. He felt that that's what he wanted to do. He had aspirations of going to the US to study, which is what everybody did those days. But he said, this way I'll go and work. And also he found, and then he went to meet Sarabhai, and Sarabhai was so charismatic. And he showed him so many things that he was going to do. So he just decided, if I get this job, this is where I go. And he got the job, and then he was sent to NASA. And the time he traveled to USA was the first time he ever got into a flight. He went there, and some 3, 4, 5 of them were there at that time. They were all the pioneers, the Ramakrishna, Kalam, Ishwar Das. So they were all there, and they all, it was all, everything was new for them. They did work at NASA, but NASA just gave them what he says like a technician's job. Obviously they wouldn't share their secrets. So he just learned, all of them just learned basic things about building a rocket. And, they didn't learn about building a rocket. He used to say there's funny things used to happen. They'll have something like almost like a Diwali rocket. They'll be sitting there and trying to fire it. And, the others used to make fun of them. So that's the kind of thing. So they spent 1 year there. Some of them spent less time. And they came back to Trivandrum. And afterwards, the journey was on their own. Really, literally, all these people with young people at one time at the peak of much of the R&D that was going on, the average age was about 27 or 28. So it was like, they had to build everything from scratch.
Great. So going back a little bit once again, so I think he grew up in Tamil Nadu at a time when there was strong anti-Brahminical sentiments. And if you were from a Brahmin family, pretty much you could give up hopes of a government job. So I just want to understand, how did Dan look at all this? How did he respond to this? And what was his views on caste? What was his views on reservations for the backward communities? How did he think about this? Because he himself in some ways was adversely impacted by all of this thinking in the state at that point of time.
One thing about him, he was very so conscious of discrepancies in society. And he was very much for reservation, even in jobs. Even in ISRO, suppose there were no, some of the reserve posts would not get enough people because there were not enough people who had got all the necessary education or whatever. But he would say, and he would argue with people and say, if you don't keep the reservation, the generations of, discrimination that has gone into making certain communities underrepresented, left out of mainstream jobs and all that. So it is very necessary that, that was his take on reservation. He was totally, I think, oblivious of caste. Though he might have grown up in that, he was totally oblivious of caste, and he was also he was a scientist all along. But he did not particularly believe in going to temples or praying, but he was not against that. It is just that his personal belief was that of a scientist. So as far as caste was concerned, I really think sincerely that he was oblivious of caste and oblivious of and pro-reservation.
So did he accompany you and his mother to the temples? He was okay with that?
Yeah, he was okay with that.
Great. So why don't we just change gears a little bit? We talk about yourself. I think you yourself have an illustrious career as a journalist. And I think you worked for iconic magazines. You wrote for magazines like Illustrated Weekly, Eve's Weekly, I think Hindustan Times, and several other names. And you also worked with people like Khushwant Singh, Pamela Philippos of Eve's Weekly, and several other noted personalities. So can you just talk a little bit about your growing up days and your early days as a journalist? What was happening in India at that point of time? The Beatles were here, Pierre Cardin was here, Rajiv Gandhi, Sonia Gandhi were getting married. So very interesting part of India at that point of time. Just talk a little bit about your family. Where did you grow up and your early days as a journalist?
I think you've done a lot of reading up about me. Because, no, when I entered the field, journalism was not open to women. It was very, very difficult to get into. So, I happened to go to Delhi where my aunt was there, and she managed to get me an internship with Hindustan Times. That's how I started, and I must have been 20, 21 at that time. And it just so happened that Pierre Cardin came at that time and nobody knew who he was. So because I was a woman and I was sitting in Hindustan Times as an intern, they suggested, why don't you go and talk to him? And that became a big thing for me, because when I went to talk to him, his models who didn't want to talk to men, because they were all also my age, they were willing to talk to me. So I got such a fantastic scoop over there when I talked to Pierre Cardin's models. So that gave me a step into the, the Beatles I didn't cover, I just looked at them from a distance because I was too junior. And Rajiv Gandhi's marriage took place, of course, and everybody in the office was very excited, but so was I. And my biggest excitement came because the Pierre Cardin models invited me to their fashion show. And when I went there, Rajiv and Sonia were just sitting like that distance from me. I'm saying, oh, Rajiv and Sonia are sitting here. That was my excitement, but that was not a time when I was really writing much. I came back to Bangalore and I got a job in Indian Express. And they first put me at the desk, but then I begged and I got on to the reporting. And I became, I think I was the first woman reporter in English in Bangalore. So because wherever I went, I was the only female around, and I had a very good boss called Mr. V.N. Subbarao, and he really guided me a lot. And even the reporters room was very comfortable. Whenever I went to cover a late night show or something, they would, I had to go home, and I would go in the newspaper van which went to give to outstation. They would drop me home. So in a way, I was looked after when there was no toilet. And after a little while, they realized that ladies also need a toilet, so they gave me a toilet. So it went like that. And then I went to Trivandrum. Trivandrum again, I had to start from scratch because there were no newspapers over there. Fortunately,
just come to Trivandrum in a while.
Okay.
So awesome. So just tell us a little bit about your childhood. I know you started your life as a journalist, but before that, you grew up in Kolar. You wrote a book about that. Tell us a little bit about your family, Dan's families. How did the families meet? How did you get married? What was common?
That becomes personal history.
That's interesting.
No, my father worked in Kolar Goldfields, so I lived there, and it was a very different from Dan's upbringing, because I grew up in a colonial town. My first classmates were all British, and we lived in those colonial houses with a lot of service providers and things. That also makes you totally oblivious of caste, because there was no caste in KGF. We were all kind of one. Even when we sat down when we went to school, after the British left, of course, after some time, though they stayed until 1957 because the owners were still British at that time. But in our class, everybody, there were minors' children, there were, all of us played together, we talked together, we ate together. So the whole business of caste and all was not there at all. We were blind to it anyway. And my aunt in Delhi knew some relation of Dan's, and so they thought that we could get together and see. It just worked. So that's how it worked out.
So the next phase of the journey is about Dan going to the US, returning, a bunch of South Indian vegetarians. I don't know how they managed in the 60s in the US, but they did manage, and coming back to India and then starting Tumba. I think that's where the Equatorial Rocket Launching Center started. And that's where the friendships began. Ishwar, Das, Kalam, Dan, and a few others. Describe a little bit before you went to Trivandrum. What was the life like for the three of them? The kind of friendship they built, breakfast at the Trivandrum railway station, Kovalam beaches. Talk a little bit about the fun times that they had.
They again came from very different backgrounds. Kalam came from Rameshwaram, and he came from a very traditional Muslim family. And his father owned a fishing boat, and he grew up there. But the thing was that because he was friends with a priest in the Rameshwaram temple, so his thinking was very different. He was a total vegetarian. I don't know whether he was a vegetarian from the start or not, but he became a vegetarian, I think, somewhere along when he was in college. So all these people became vegetarian. They were all vegetarians, and they went in the 60s to NASA, where eating non-veg, everybody was mostly non-vegetarian, and they couldn't get anything in the canteen to sustain themselves. It could be all right for a day or two, but if it's a long time, and they didn't have any place to cook also. So apparently one day they went and they saw one small cafeteria, and there was a lady there, and she said, they said, "Do you have vegetarian food?" She said, "I'll give you all the stuff. If you want, you cook whatever you want and have it." So they put all the things that were there, including the cheese and the vegetables, and they made something and baked it. And they all liked it so much. So that lady named it The Thing. So whenever they went that side, they said, "Can we have something?" "You mean you want the thing?" "Okay." And she would cook it for them. And so, some people tried to kind of persuade them to start eating meat because it's good for your health and all that, but they didn't. They came back. Kalam remained a vegetarian all along. Most of them did. And he used to come to our house quite often. I mean, they lived in the Bhavan Lodge in Trivandrum. It was on the main road.
In my mind clearly. The Bhavan Lodge, the railway station.
Yeah, the Indra Bhavan Lodge was just close to the secretariat actually. And they would, most of them were bachelors. All of them were bachelors who lived there. And many of them came from Karnataka, quite a few from Tamil Nadu. And of course, the local people wouldn't stay in the Indra Bhavan Lodge. Some of the people who came from North India had taken a house and they stayed there. But there were some over here. So that itself became a kind of mini India. The Indra Bhavan Lodge where they all stayed and where they all worked together and all that. And once they started recruiting, then more and more people came and all that. So, but the thing was food. Indra Bhavan, I think it's always food. Because Indra Bhavan, again, there was no cooking. Somebody would bring coffee and give it. And these people who came from outside of Kerala did not particularly like that boiled rice. So they wanted raw rice. So the only place they could get was in the station. So they would go to the railway station every day, have their breakfast, or idli or whatever, pack up some lunch. And the way to go to Tumba, which was about 20 kilometers from Trivandrum, was by a rattling old bus. We could go to many other places and finally land up in Tumba. So when they took that food and they went, by the time they reached, it would be almost time for lunch. It would take so much time. They would finish whatever work they had over there. There was no transportation inside the thing. There were no buildings also. So the church was a major place. The church, can I talk a little bit about the church?
Absolutely, very interesting story.
The church actually, because there were fishermen over there. Sorry. The fishermen it was a fishing village. And the fishermen were mostly Catholics. So the church was a very important meeting point for all of them. But it just so happened that Tumba was the very place that they needed for scientific experiments because the magnetic equator passes through over there. And it was the ideal place for launching. So Dr. Sarabhai and many other scientists who had gone there decided that was the place. So Dr. Sarabhai spoke to the collector of Tumba and Yeah, Madhavan Nair was there. Not our
Not
Madhav,
ours, ISRO.
our ISRO Madhavan Nair. It was another Madhavan Nair, and he spoke to him. And so Madhavan Nair spoke to for the bishop over there. And he said, we'll give a different place, we'll give a different beach, we'll make sure that they are relocated properly, and we'll even build a church for them, but can you please give this? So the bishop spoke to his congregation and they agreed. And so it was mainly Madhavan Nair and Sarabhai who managed to get this for him. Many people have said Kalam did it, but Kalam was a young chap at that time. I don't think he had even seen ISRO when all this happened. So, that's how we got the church was given. And in the beginning, they were not allowed to do anything over there, but they slowly began doing it. So that iconic picture you see of Dan and Kalam sitting in front of the altar and building, that was not a major rocket, it was just a payload that they were building. But that's what they did, and they built small rockets. Most of the rockets at that time were launched were from different countries. So they had signed a UN agreement at that time that they could bring their rockets and we would provide the launch facilities. Nothing was from India at that time. Everything was donated by different countries, And so by the time I went, which was in 1970, he had been there for about 7 years. And there was a big, it was like some kind of international community, I was thinking, because there were so many people who had come with rockets for launching. And even the people who were working over there, they were from all over the country. And I was, even as soon as I went, I was surprised to find there was a Karnataka, it was called Mysore Association at that time. There was a Mysore Association, and then there was a Tamil Sangam, there was a Bengali Association, there was a Punjabi Association, there were so many, Telugu. All of them were there, and all of them would celebrate functions and all. We would be invited to all those things. So it was really very interesting, and it was so, we could just walk into those, because it was not, those days there was not much security or anything like that, So we could just walk into Tumba and watch a launching. I watched launchings from quite close. The very first launching I saw, actually, the rocket didn't take off at all. I went there and I was standing on there was a terrace over there on top of the countdown tracking station. So I was just standing there along with a whole lot of new brides had come, because everybody was young at that time. So we were all standing there and watching. And the rocket didn't take off. And all the other husbands came and took away their wives. My husband never came. I got really scared, because it was a beach, it was dark, it was unknown, I didn't know Malayalam, I didn't know what I was going to do. So I came down and I was standing. Suddenly Kalam came in a jeep. And he said, "What are you doing? I think my buddy forgot you." He put me in a jeep and took me. And then only I found my husband with his head inside the rocket. And came out and then we went home. Next day they repaired it, and next day he insisted I should go again, and I saw the launch take off. After that, I've seen many, many launches. We used to have a Russian rocket which used to take off every Wednesday. It was a weather rocket. The rocket would come, M100, it would come from Russia, a contingent of them, and then they would launch. And that was an entertainment for whole of Trivandrum. Anybody who wanted could get a pass. They could come and stand on the beach and watch the M100 take off. It was quite a sight, actually. And people who came, even our relations and friends who came, this was the entertainment we take them. If they came on I think it was a Wednesday or Thursday, I think it was a Wednesday, they would get to see M100 taking off. But of course, as things grew and, we could no longer have people just walking in and out and all that. So things became very different. So that was
So I think since Kalam has come up a couple of times already, we'll just make a slight detour and then come back to Tumba. So, there were talks about, Kalam being an amazing leader, but an average engineer. He came from a very ordinary background, fisherman's family, delivered newspapers. sometimes when people become famous, you create these stories. How much of this is true and how much of this is a bit of a hype?
I wouldn't say he was ordinary. He was an extraordinary leader, definitely, because he motivated people really to do things. He would stay all night. He would lead by his own actions. He was not brilliant in his studies, I believe, as he himself would tell me every time. I was not brilliant like your husband, he would say, but they were very close friends. Very nobody talked about. Academics don't matter after a while. It is more important what you produce, what you achieve. And yes, he did come from a fisherman's family, but he was not a fisherman. His father owned a fishing boat. His uncle owned a newspaper agency. So he used to tell me during holidays he would go and distribute newspapers because it was a fun thing to do. But as people build hype, they make it into as if he was earning his living putting newspapers, or that he's a fishing family or whatever it is. So I think if you see that Rocket Boys, it just makes such a ridiculous fantasy out of Kalam. I think he would have laughed.
Yeah. So you went there sometime in 70s or 70 probably in that year. So and there were some very interesting and hilarious incidents as well. You described the first rocket as a Diwali kind of a rocket, and I read so many interesting incidents. There was a minister from Tamil Nadu who had come, and he was a very humble guy though. But when everything was explained to him in terms of what you were doing in Tumba, at the end of it, it tells you in Tamil, Thambi, how many people did you send up in these rockets? He was asking this question. And there was other incidents as well. So talk a little bit about those fun days. And you were a modern, person from a big city going into a conservative town like Trivandrum. So how did people see you there, and what was the response? And how did you cope with that city?
I don't know. I came from Bangalore. And as my boys were sitting there, will tell you, they were embarrassed that their mother was, first of all, driving a car, which nobody else did, and wore sleeveless blouses, which nobody else did. So sometimes they tell me, stay out of the school. No, I don't come inside. But it was fun. It was very different for me. I am also pretty strong-minded, I guess, so I didn't want to change the way I looked or behaved. And at first, even the journalist community was found it difficult to accept me, because in those days, again, we were back to the place where there were no women journalists at all. Today, if you see, so many of the women journalists come from Kerala. I feel so excited and happy to see that. In fact, all over the country, just to deviate a little bit, from a time when there were zero women journalists, today I think more than 50% of the journalists are women. And I feel very proud to see that and see how that has happened. So anyway, those days I would drive my car, I would go wherever, and I would, I was often the only woman who would be in the secretariat standing with all the males. And unlike the Bangalore journalists who accepted me quite easily, the male journalists, Trivandrum male journalists kept their distance. They didn't want to talk to me. Maybe because I didn't know Malayalam, maybe I looked like an alien, I don't know what it was, but many of them didn't in the beginning. But afterwards, I was totally accepted. I was so totally accepted. I also totally accepted Trivandrum. And when it was time to leave after 20 years, I really didn't want to leave at all. But it was a very enlightening experience for me also. Some of these things which Dan has talked about in his book, I didn't personally see about the Tamil politician. But you will be surprised to know, even recently, after Chandrayaan went up, somebody went and asked a politician in Rajasthan, what do you think about this journey? He says, after the people come back from there, we'll find out. Even today, it's like that. I think people don't even read the newspaper. So I think it's generally the same things which people used to say in those days. Why do we need a rocket when people are dying of poverty over here? And the same. Unfortunately, my personal contact with Sarabhai was just, I met him about 2 or 3 times because he passed away soon after I did. But he would come to Trivandrum quite often. But my husband had a very close contact with him because he was one of the persons who was, in fact, he says he was the first person to be recruited by Sarabhai. And Sarabhai was very fond of Dan. But Sarabhai had this kind of charisma. Anybody who interacted with him would feel a very personal bond and connection. They would feel that, I am special to Sarabhai. So every person I met in that era who had actually worked in ISRO and met Sarabhai, even though he might have met him only once, they used to say, Sarabhai was very fond of him. And I had a personal equation with him, and it would be true. One of the things he would do, because R&D was at a very early stage at that time. So what he would do is, when he came, he would ask each of them, what do you want to work on? Somebody would say, I want to work on red arrow. Somebody would say, I want to work on, some system or the other. And he would tell all of them, you make whatever it was. He would give them some funding and all of them would do something. And he would choose, or he would integrate all of them. All these people who have worked in various, this is only I have second-hand knowledge because I don't know personally what happened. This is what Dan used to tell me, and Kalam also used to say, we'd all be so excited, we'd be working, we would compete with each other and want to do something. So that is the way he encouraged him. And he was so tireless. I used to wonder, how does he do this? He'd come and then he'd be taking meetings and he'd go on till late in the night. And Dan and all, he would come back at 12. Early in the morning at 5 o'clock he'd get up. He used to stay in the Kolam Palace. There was a palace, Harrison Castle it was called in Kovalam. Get up and go have a nice swim in the bay early in the morning and then be fresh, work with all these people. And if he was supposed to go that day, he had contacts with everybody, I think. He would just say, okay, you, all of you come with me. All of them would get into the plane with him and they would go to Ahmedabad. They'd continue the discussion on the flight and we'd go there, they'd finish and they'd come back. So that was the kind of, it was almost like a very, he treated me like his own family. It was a old-fashioned in a way, because I can't think of anybody working like that today.
Yes.
But that is the way they worked. They all got, he worked anyway. So when he came, and I met him 2 or 3 times, and the thing is, first time I met him, it was at some party which they were having. And he said, oh, I'm very happy to see you. I would, you're a journalist, is it? Can you show me some of your writing? I had not bothered even to keep my writing. I just, anything published in the paper, I pushed the paper somewhere and keep it, and they were all tearing actually. He said, no, you must cut it and you must keep it properly, you must file it, it be, anytime it will be useful to you, he would say. So, he said also at that time, if you want to get a job at ISRO also, we can look at it because we're looking for people who would, be able to write about ISRO. But when we went home, Dan and I discussed it and I thought, I don't know if I want a job at ISRO, I want to continue being a journalist. But anyway, it never happened because Sarabhai died soon after. I met him only once more before that. And I very clearly remember the day he died because my husband had gone there and he was talking to Sarabhai till 11 or 11:30 in the night, and he came back at 12 o'clock. And he said he still got 1 or 2 people he wanted to talk to. And then in the morning he was getting ready to go by about 7:38. He wanted to go to the thing. And he got a call because Dan also he lived so long in Trivandrum, so many of the press people knew him very well. So some press person rang up and said, Sarabhai has passed away. He couldn't believe it. He thought it was some hoax. There was not so much fake news those days as there is these days. But he thought it was a hoax actually. And he said, are you sure? Are you sure? And at that time, because some cross connection, somebody from Delhi was ringing up and asking this fellow, is the news correct that Sarabhai has passed away? So that was enough. I mean, he just dropped everything and he went to office. And people are ringing me up and asking, do you know that Sarabhai passed away? I said, I don't know anything about it. And of course, he had gone, and most of the people got into the flight with his body, went to Ahmedabad and all that. Dad stayed back because somebody had to be here also. So that was a real tragedy. Everybody was so heartbroken and so completely shattered. Because he's only 52. Who would have expected him to go? But when, of course, next Dawal came, it was a totally different thing.
So, Mohit, I think you're very ruthless. Such an interesting discussion. You're telling me 5 minutes. That's not fair. Okay. Okay. So I think since we have limited time, I'll just talk to you about some interesting topics. One is I want to understand from you, the ISRO culture. I think clearly stood out when Dr. Somnath was speaking when Chandrayaan 2 landed on the moon. I think the way Dr. Somnath brought his entire team to the front, got them to speak about it. And the most important thing of all, I think he said that Chandrayaan 3 was built on the previous ones. It's just incremental. So he was giving credit to the previous teams as well. So on the ISRO culture, tell us a little bit about, one enduring image that remains in all our minds are the women, number of women in the ISRO who are amazing engineers, researchers, scientists, Mangalyaan to Chandrayaan. You see so many of them in the control room, clapping, cheering. So when did this whole thing start of recruiting women? And the early stages it was all guys, we went, I think I read, Dan interviewed a woman, she fainted. That was the first time you tried to recruit a woman. So how did this whole thing start and when did this reach such a crescendo?
So, first shall I talk about the ISRO culture?
Yes, please.
You want me to talk about the women?
What about Mohit? You can.
So the ISRO culture is that nobody is personally responsible for creating something. Research is something which is jointly done by everybody in ISRO. I mean, that is a first very clear thing. So even at their review meetings, Dan will tell me that everybody, every single person, including the latest recruit, would be called to the review meeting. Everyone had a voice. Even if he was a very young person, if he raised a question or he pointed out something, people would listen to him patiently. It may be wrong, it may be right. But that was something which was very inclusive. That all meetings were very inclusive. Another thing was like, the fact that so many different streams of engineering had to go into this. So many different streams of science, engineering, everything had to go into it. So they learned the fact that they have to all unite together, they have to cooperate with each other. And actually, Sarabhai in one of his early speeches had said, the very fact that people learn to cooperate and to tolerate each other, to point out faults and accept them if it is necessary, So those things are very important even in everyday life. So that ISRO culture remains even today. That there's test and evaluation and things like that are all very subjects which can be very thorny also, because you say you've done something wrong, that the person may not be willing to accept it. But you have to accept it, you have to analyze, because failure analysis is a very major part. So this is the kind of ISRO culture which exists even today. And if you noticed, Dr. Somnath, he brought every single person on the dais and introduced them. That is what it is all about. It is not any single political party, or it is not single human being which created it. And Chandrayaan today is built on the shoulders of everybody who's worked in ISRO for the past 60 odd years. Otherwise, we would never have achieved this. Regarding women, yes, there were no women in the beginning. And in fact, even stenographers were all male. And in fact, when they wanted to start recruiting female stenographers, many of the top bosses objected because they said, women will get pregnant, they won't be able to do. I mean, imagine even if stenography, they objected to what would they say when they saw the women scientists today. But it was always open, and there were women scientists right in the beginning. As you say, the first engineer Dan interviewed at Random Engineering College. She fainted and he got scared because he thought he'd done something, scared her or something. But she rose to become one of the top engineers in
No.
I've forgotten her name. She was an early pilot, and nobody rose to that height in that this thing. Now, as more and more people, especially after the 1980s, I think more women got recruited, and so it became. Today, you will see that women are there in topmost positions, and I hope that one of these days the chairperson will also be waiting for that.
I think the conversation will be a little incomplete if we don't talk of some of the amazing launches. SLV 3. The first was a failure, but second we put Rohini, into orbit, and then ESLV 2 failures. Third one was successful. PSLV became an amazing success after the first one, and then the GSLV. So GSLV, I think, was the ultimate achievement. Vikram Sarabhai was dreaming of putting a geostationary satellite into orbit, even before we had had the basic rocketry to put a 30 kg satellite into space. So around the GSLV, there was a lot of controversy because Russians, we had tied up with them. The Americans at that point of time were imposing sanctions. They told Russia not to give us those cryogenic technologies. And then missile technology control regime came in. Gorbachev was there. And then Nambi Narayanan was also there. There was a spy scandal at that point of time. Around that period, what really happened? What was Nambi Narayanan really involved? What did ISRO think at that point of time? Nobody stood up, nobody spoke. Case came. He was investigated. Nobody knew what. And then today he's suddenly a hero. And so tell us a little bit about the times of the GSLV, the controversy, the country, geopolitics, and a bit of the Nambi Narayanan.
It's a very big question. Very huge question. No, GSLV, yes. What you said about GSLV is correct. That Russia had promised cryogenic technology to India. And in fact, a couple of cryo rockets had come already. When USA intervened and Russia was going through a very tough time, and the USA said if you sell technology to India, because GSLV, that technology can be used for missiles.
Correct.
So they didn't want to share that. And it was not the first time that sanctions were imposed against India. Previously also, whenever they asked for anything, you wouldn't get, this rocket technology is something which you cannot, or satellite, all these technology is not something you can just go and buy. I mean, it's so secretive, people don't like to share. Just as an offline thing, I would say, one of my cousins who lives in the USA was telling me he was watching, and he saw people from ISRO describing exactly how the Chandrayaan was launched, how everything happened, and they were discussing on television all the technology that they put. He says, NASA is so secretive, they won't even let us go and see the rocket from a distance. It's a proud thing that India is willing to share its knowledge and not keep it kind of closeted within. Anyway, the thing is that, the GSLV, they had to do reverse engineering of the rockets in order to finally get their rocket going, but it took longer. What was scheduled to take off in the 1980s, it took much longer because of the sanctions that were imposed. Nambi Narayan was working in France, but I don't think he was involved really with the GSLV. In fact, this whole GSLV thing happened after this spy thing. If historically that is how it was. He's a good friend of ours, and he was not a spy. Why he got caught in this whole thing, that's a different question, and I don't even want to go down there because I don't know enough. He's written a whole book about it, and a whole film has been made about him. So he was not a spy, and the GSLV was not delayed because of his arrest. Those are two things I can say clearly. apart from that, I don't want to comment on that.
Nice. I think you said it, everything. So amazing, Mohit. I think I'll finally respect your request. This is an awesome book. I hope this 30-40 minutes of conversation has created enough curiosity for you to pick up this book and read it. It's one of the finest books I've read. It's the best story about India's finest startup and the Make in India story. I think it's the best case. You must read it. Thank you, Mohit.
Thank you very much.